They found her collapsed on the chapel floor, blood trickling from her nose, her eyes wide open but vacant, like something had been taken from her. Sister Eliza, 26, had been inside St. Hildegard Monastery for over 7 years. She hadn't left once. So when the medical report confirmed she was 4 weeks pregnant, it hit like a thunderclap. No visitors, no outside contact, no men. And yet, this. Welcome to Revenge Her Way, where truth is stranger than fiction, and the justice is always personal. Sister Eliza wasn't the only one acting strange. 3 nights before her collapse, she confided in Sister Helena that she'd been waking up drenched in sweat, with flashes of a hallway she swore she'd never seen. A long corridor, sterile white, and a handprint smeared in blood on the wall. Mother Corinne, the head of the monastery, tried to keep things quiet. But when Helena checked the security footage from Eliza's room, the timestamp hit 3:33 a.m., exactly when her digital clock had recorded movement. Only. No one ever entered or left. And then came the recording. Buried in Eliza's phone was a 17-second audio file she didn't remember saving. Faint, scratchy, but unmistakable. A voice whispering in a language no one could identify. And that's when they discovered Sister Beatrice was showing the exact same symptoms. But her secret went even deeper. He clutched that crumpled paper bag like it was all he had left in the world. It looked pitiful, just a brown sack with a grease stain down the side and a rip along the bottom seam. But what was inside said everything. 2 moldy ham and cheese sandwiches, barely wrapped in foil. A piece of paper, torn from a grocery flyer with scribbles in blue marker. Bus 36, 7:05 a.m., Depot 4. And a broken toy robot, one arm missing, the other dangling by a thread. It wasn't lunch. It was a getaway kit. 2 weeks ago, Elliot had started stashing things, quietly, carefully. He was 10, but already he knew to move in silence. That bag had lived under his bed, between loose floorboards and layers of guilt, waiting. The sandwiches he'd made himself, late one night while Rick snored in the recliner with a bottle of something sharp still clutched in his fist. The note he wrote from memory, eyes scanning the transit schedules posted outside the corner store. The robot? That was from before. Before Rick. Before the silence. Before the bruises he pretended not to notice. The night before everything changed, Elliot had practiced unlocking the back door with a safety pin. He'd watched a video on a library computer under DIY hacks and tried it over and over again until the pin snapped in half. His hands were small. That helped. But his heart? It was too full of something bitter to keep still. Rick Walker wasn't his father. Not really. But everyone told him he was. After his mom died in a car crash 8 months ago, Elliot had ended up in Rick's trailer because that's what the paper said. Next of kin. The cops called it unfortunate, said Rick had a record, but nothing recent, said they'd monitor. Whatever that meant. Elliot called him Dad. He thought maybe it would make things easier. It didn't. Rick never hit him in front of others. That was part of his game. At the diner, he was just the grumpy guy with a busted knee who always asked for extra coffee refills. At church, he nodded at the pastor, kept his hand firm on Elliot's shoulder, smiling for the world, cold behind closed doors. And Elliot had learned not to cry. He learned not to flinch. He learned to plan. That morning, he sat on the edge of his mattress, bag in hand, sneakers on, jacket zipped. It was still dark, but the birds had started chirping like they didn't know this was the day he might disappear. He crept to the back door, key in one hand, heart in the other. And just as he slid the bolt back, "Where you going, boy?" Rick stood in the hallway, one sock on, belt in hand. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice soft in the way Elliot hated most. Soft meant slow pain. Elliot froze. Rick took 2 steps closer and the floor creaked. "What's in the bag?" He yanked it from Elliot's hands. The sandwiches fell out, hit the floor with a dull, wet sound. The toy clattered against the baseboard. Rick's fingers found the note. "Depot 4?" he read, voice rising. "You think you're just gonna run?" Elliot didn't answer. He just stared at the robot, lying there on its side, staring back with one dead eye. Rick didn't yell. That was the scariest part. He just turned and walked into the kitchen. Elliot heard the drawer. The one that always stuck. the one that held the knives. But this time, Rick didn't come back with a knife. He came back with a manila envelope, thick, folded once in half. He threw it on the floor. "You want to know the truth?" he said, voice low, guttural. "Go ahead. Open it." Elliot didn't move. Couldn't. His feet were ice, but his hand reached out, almost like it wasn't his. Inside that envelope was a death certificate. Not his mother's, his, or at least it had his name, his birthday, his old address. But next to status, the word deceased. And a second paper, a transfer of custody, not from his mom, from a private institution in Montana he'd never even heard of. He looked up. Rick was smiling. Not the grin he gave the pastor, not the one from the diner. Something darker. "You're not running anywhere," he said, "because you don't even exist." And that's when the knocking started on the front door. Slow, rhythmic, like someone who already knew what was inside. He's a good kid, clean, American-born, healthy, doesn't ask questions. That's what Elliot heard at 12:47 a.m. from the hallway, standing barefoot on the cold linoleum floor outside Rick's locked room. The light from under the door flickered slightly, and through the sliver, he saw Rick hunched over the old laptop, shirtless, smoking, speaking in that syrupy voice he only used when he wanted something. The voice on the other end was thickly accented, clipped, and low. A woman. She said something in Ukrainian, and Rick chuckled. No paperwork. Like I said, we keep it simple. You wire the 10 grand, I'll handle the rest. One-way ticket, straight to O'Hare. You meet the boy there. No one asks anything. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. $10,000, one-way ticket. Boy, that wasn't some story. That was him. He backed away slowly, holding his iPad so tight it creaked in his grip. The old thing barely worked. Cracked screen, short battery, but it still had voice memos. He had the sense to hit record just seconds before the call ended. Long enough to catch Rick's last line, the one that made Elliot's stomach flip inside out. "You got yourself a son. Pickups in 12 days. 12 days. He crawled back to bed, pulled the covers over his head, and shook so hard the springs creaked. He thought about the bag under the floorboards, the sandwiches, the flyer scrap, the toy robot, and suddenly it felt like a joke. He wasn't running away anymore. He was being sold. The next morning, Rick was in a good mood. That was never a good sign. He poured Elliot a bowl of cereal without being asked, even put real milk in it instead of water. He ruffled Elliot's hair as he walked past and whistled to himself while counting bills at the kitchen table. Elliot counted too. 4 stacks of 20s, a 5th one wrapped with a red rubber band. He watched Rick tuck them into a yellow envelope marked Wells Fargo Mortgage Debt before shoving it under a stack of junk mail. Later that day, Elliot overheard a phone call from the bathroom, Rick arguing with someone about payday loans and interest spikes. Something about $6,200 and the clock ticking. Rick cursed under his breath and slammed the phone down. Elliot stood quietly on the other side of the door, feeling the heat rise in his chest. Rick was in trouble, and he was the payment. That night, Elliot pulled the iPad out again and played the recording over and over, making sure it had caught everything. He didn't know much about the law, but he knew what being sold felt like. He Googled the words he didn't understand. Adoption trafficking, unregulated guardianship, international child rehoming loophole. His fingers were shaking, but not from fear, from something else. Something he hadn't felt since his mom died. Rage. Rick wasn't even his father. The documents proved it. But what Elliot hadn't realized until now was that Rick hadn't taken him in out of pity or guilt or some twisted sense of duty. He'd taken him in for profit, a long game, a payday, and it was almost here. Elliot knew he had to do something. But what? Who would believe a 10-year-old? With no parents, no legal records, and no voice? The cops barely glanced at him last time. He had one chance, that recording. He'd need to send it somewhere safe, to someone who could listen, who could act. But there was a password on the Wi-Fi now, and Rick kept the modem in his room. So he waited. 2 days later, Rick passed out drunk on the couch, TV on, whiskey bottle still in hand. Elliot tiptoed into his room, heart pounding, and pulled the laptop open. He connected the iPad, opened the recording, hovered his finger over the send button. But then, From behind the curtain, the sound of footsteps. Not Rick. Outside the window, a black car sat parked with its lights off, and someone was already walking up the steps. The sheriff stood at the front door, hand resting on his belt, eyes flicking between Rick and the wrinkled paperwork he held out like a wet napkin. "We're gonna need the original birth certificate and the guardianship transfer, Mr. Walker," he said, voice low but steady. Rick scratched his head, fake confusion washing over his face like he'd practiced it in the mirror. "Yeah, we had a fire back in 18, he mumbled. "Lost a bunch of documents. You know how it is." The sheriff didn't flinch. "There's no record of any fire report on file." Rick's smile stiffened. "Didn't think I needed to file one. It was small." Behind the sheriff, a younger officer held a tablet. He looked up, brows knitted. "There's no birth record for Elliot Walker in the state of Oregon. Nothing in public health, nothing in the archives." Rick's eyes darted, lips twitching, but he didn't say a word. Elliot stood frozen in the hallway, listening from behind the cracked door. He could feel it, that slow unraveling, the careful web Rick had spun for years, finally catching on itself. 3 days later, the case was passed to a field investigator out of Des Moines, Iowa, Rick's supposed hometown. A man named Clay Barker, who'd worked missing child cases since '99. He dug deep, visited local courthouses, talked to funeral homes, spoke with the janitor at Elliot's old elementary school. And that's when everything snapped into focus. There had been a funeral, almost 6 years ago. A car accident on I-80 took the lives of Ethan and Rachel Lansing, Elliot's real parents. The obituary listed their son, 5-year-old Elliot, as survived by his uncle, Richard Walker. But here's the thing. Richard Walker was never listed in any will. No court-approved custody transfer. No legal adoption. Nothing. 1 week after the funeral, Rick packed a small suitcase, took the child, and vanished. Just like that, Clay found a neighbor, an old woman named Mrs. Carlisle, who still had a dusty security camera facing her front porch. She didn't remember much until Clay showed her a photo. Then she gasped. "That boy," she whispered, tapping the screen. "That man picked him up right after the funeral. Just said he was taking him for ice cream. The boy didn't even have shoes on." The footage was grainy, time-stamped March 15th, 2017, but there was no mistaking the tiny face peeking out from the back seat of the beat-up green Pontiac. No mistaking the man driving. Rick had stolen Elliot, and no one had stopped him. Meanwhile, a whole time zone away, in the humid heart of Tampa, Florida, a man named Charles Lansing had been searching for his nephew ever since. He'd posted missing child reports, scoured message boards, filed police reports in 2 states, even launched a website. FindElliot.org, but nothing ever stuck. No one ever connected the dots. Until now. The sheriff called Charles that same night. "I think we found him," he said, "but it's complicated." Back in Oregon, Elliot sat on the edge of the bathtub, listening as Rick argued into the phone. He didn't know who was on the other end, but the panic was seeping out of Rick's voice now, sharp, fast, desperate. "You said no one would look. You said this wouldn't trace." Elliot pressed the iPad to his chest. For the first time, he felt something other than fear. He felt seen. But as the sun set that evening, a new car appeared on their street. It parked across the road. No plates, tinted windows, and inside someone was watching the house. The courtroom was too quiet. Elliot's sneakers made soft thuds as he walked across the polished floor, toward the table where Rick sat in a wrinkled blue shirt, hands cuffed, eyes sunken. For a moment, the 10-year-old boy just stood there, fingers twitching by his sides, the silence wrapping around him like fog. Then, steady as stone, he looked up. "You fed me. You lied to me. You almost sold me." A murmur rippled through the room. Rick's head dropped like someone had struck him, his shoulders sagging under a weight only he knew how to carry. The judge didn't flinch. The attorneys didn't blink. But Rick started to cry. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," he said, voice breaking. "I swear. God, I just didn't know what else to do." He wiped his eyes with cuffed hands, a pathetic gesture that only made the moment heavier. "I had nothing, Elliot. No job, no one. The bank was calling every day. I thought maybe you'd have a better chance. With someone who could give you more. I wasn't going to hurt you. I never laid a hand on you. Elliot didn't move. He just stared, because they both knew that wasn't true. Rick looked up again, desperate now. You were a good kid. You never complained. You trusted me. I didn't deserve that. I know I didn't. The courtroom was full. Reporters lined the back wall, a camera crew outside, but no one made a sound. The judge cleared her throat and motioned to the defense. Rick's attorney, a thin man in a cheap gray suit, stood. Your Honor, we ask the court to take into account the mental health history of my client. Mr. Walker has been diagnosed with clinical depression and attempted suicide in 2019. He has no prior convictions, no history of violence. He took Elliot in when no one else did. He turned toward Elliot. That doesn't excuse what he did, but we ask for compassion, for understanding. Across the aisle, the prosecution stood with a folder in hand. Your Honor, this is a printout from Mr. Walker's PayPal account. It shows a $2,000 deposit received 2 weeks prior to his arrest. The note attached says, for initial arrangements. It matches the date and content of the recorded Zoom call between Mr. Walker and a couple overseas seeking to adopt a child, illegally. She held up another sheet. This isn't desperation. It's premeditated. He orchestrated this. He planned it, and he knew it was wrong. Rick closed his eyes. The tears stopped. His hands clenched in his lap. Elliot stepped back from the stand. He wasn't crying. He wasn't shaking. He was just done. The judge leaned forward. Thank you, Elliot. You may return to your seat. As the boy walked back, something strange happened. A few members of the audience clapped, soft, hesitant. One woman wiped her eyes. A man in a suit leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked on Elliot like he was watching something bigger than justice. Rick looked around the courtroom. He saw it too. The shift, the unraveling. The judge called a brief recess. Outside the courtroom doors, Elliot sat on the bench next to a tall man in a navy blazer, Charles Lansing, his uncle. You okay? Charles asked, placing a careful hand on Elliot's shoulder. Elliot nodded. But then Charles pulled something from his pocket, a photo. A woman, smiling, arms wrapped around a boy barely 5, wearing the same eyes as Elliot. I think your mom would have been proud, Charles said. Elliot didn't answer right away, because just then he noticed someone at the end of the hallway, a woman in a gray coat, watching them. She wasn't holding a camera. She wasn't part of the press. But Elliot had seen her before, once, in the corner of Rick's screen during that midnight Zoom call. He didn't flinch when he saw him. 6 years had passed, but Elliot recognized the way Rick walked, shoulders rounded, hands buried deep in his pockets like he was trying to disappear. They met in the courtyard of a halfway house just outside Jacksonville. The sky was pale and cloudy, the air heavy with humidity. But Elliot's voice was calm. Even when he said it, "Hi, Rick," not Dad, not even Mr. Walker, just Rick. Rick stopped in his tracks, his eyes now older, sunken behind years of prison walls, flicked upward like he wasn't sure he deserved to meet Elliot's gaze. You grew up, Rick said, like it surprised him. People do, Elliot replied, then sat down on the edge of the bench and waited. Rick sat across from him, and for a moment neither spoke. Just the soft hum of traffic in the distance and the faint creak of metal as Rick shifted in his seat. I didn't think you'd come, Rick said eventually. I sent letters. Elliot nodded. I read them. Rick waited, but Elliot didn't add more. Instead, the boy, now 15, tall, sharp-eyed, calm, looked down at the bracelet on his wrist, a braided band of blue and gray. He'd made it himself, back in Florida, in his room, the one with the shelves full of robotics awards and a framed certificate for a STEM scholarship program. His uncle had helped hang it. I wanted to see you, Elliot said, finally. Not because I forgive you, not yet, but because I needed to know you were still human. Rick blinked hard. I'm trying to be. Elliot nodded slowly, lips pressed tight. I don't hate you, Rick. I did for a while. Then I tried to forget you. That didn't work either. Rick's mouth moved like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. I talk to kids now, Elliot continued. On my blog at school, I tell them what happened, not to shame you, but so they know what to look for, what love isn't supposed to feel like. A long pause stretched between them. Rick leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head down. I'm glad you're okay, he said quietly. I don't deserve to be. But I am. Elliot stood up. The sun had broken through the clouds, just enough to cast a faint shadow across the ground. I'm okay because someone showed up, not because you didn't. And then he walked away. 1 week later, Elliot stood on stage at his high school's TEDx event. A single spotlight lit his face as he scanned the crowd. His voice was steady, honest. I once trusted the wrong person, he began, but I never stopped believing in the right ones. He talked about his mother, about the uncle who found him, about the system that almost failed, but didn't, and about every child who sits awake at night, wondering if anyone sees them. They do, Elliot said. Sometimes they just haven't found you yet. At the end of his talk, as the crowd rose to their feet, Elliot looked out into the lights and smiled, not with bitterness, but with power. Your past doesn't get to own your future, he said. You do.